Furina's weapon had the unfortunate fate of being paired with Baiju's, which for many people meant this was a banner to avoid. Hopefully you resisted that temptation, and next time when she comes around, you will have a better banner to roll on, but that begs the question, how many weapons are actually worse than Jade Fall's Splendor? That is what I'm here to weigh in on, and of course this is going to be my opinion, but it's going to be based on a few factors. How niche is the weapon? Can many different characters use it, or is it only designed for maybe one specific character and maybe someone else happens to benefit from it? How future-proofed is it, meaning how likely is a new character made down the line to actually be able to use this thing? How does it compare to other limited 5-star weapons or even some of the standard 5-star weapons? And even more importantly, can it beat the 4-star alternatives? Because that really hurts a weapon's viability if it's not even as good as a 4-star. Among some other reasons, but those are the major ones. So let's get right into it, going from best to worst. Number 10, the first great magic, also known as Linny's signature bow. Okay, stop your angry typing right now because I already know you're probably doing it. Hear me out. There are quite a few limited weapons in the game, but honestly, there are more good ones than bad, meaning that some of the ones in this list, especially on the lower end like this, aren't actually bad weapons, they're just kind of here by process of elimination. Linny's bow is phenomenally designed for his own kit, as signature weapons often are, but the problem is when you put it on other other chart attack bow users such as Ganyu, they're not likely to want to stack the team with characters of their own element, meaning they'll never benefit from the true damage potential of this bow. Even as a stat stick, this weapon is pretty impressive, and the good news is that the passive isn't completely geared towards charge attack users, meaning that other people can use it. The thing that ultimately lands it on this list is the fact that limited bows are so insane. I mean, like, look at every other limited bow we have. They're all so good, and there's pretty much a bow for any flavor of character you could imagine. Number 9, Kyros Varity, aka Yaimiko's signature weapon. Many of the same things I said for Linny's bow also applies to this weapon. It is by no means a terrible weapon, but it is rather niche, and while it can be used as a stat stick for many other Catalyst users, the main problem is that the special effect, the passive, that is not likely to be maximized on any of the other characters we have in this game. Characters that have multiple charges of their skill or a really low cooldown are few and far between. The hard to achieve requirement is a pretty bad thing in itself, but the reward for completing it is more elemental skill damage, so unless your character is predominantly elemental skill damage such as Yaimiko, it's just not likely to be a super valuable weapon on them. Because even if you do get all 3 stacks, you are awarded with a 12% all elemental damage bonus. That's just something you would have expected most other weapons to give as a base passive before the main passive. Number 8, Calamityquer, also known as Shenhe's signature weapon. This weapon suffers from being even more niche than the previous 2 that I mentioned. It's the expected result to have a signature weapon that is perfectly designed for the character it is released with, but in this case, Shenhe's needs are so hyper-specific that no other character can truly utilize this weapon for what it is. With this weapon's high base attack and a small attack percent substat, that makes it a perfect weapon to equip on Xiao, a character that has an insane amount of damage percent bonus coming from his kit, meaning that percent attack is very valuable on him, or just base attack to scale all that percent attack off of. So for this weapon to be a rather mediocre option, even for Xiao, means that this thing really has no future as a DPS weapon and is really just a consolation prize if you got it and don't have Shenhe. Not to mention the fact that if any character uses this alongside Bennett, its value is going to greatly go down. It's just way too much attack. You don't need a weapon with this absurd amount of base attack, plus a character like Bennett. Number 7, the Unforged. Now, I think a lot of people would probably put this as the worst weapon in the game because it's the most memed on limited weapon I have ever heard of. Nobody trash talks a weapon as much as the Unforged, except maybe the Coconut Donut or the Jade Fall Splendor. But before those ever existed, it was the Unforged. This weapon never really had a good reputation, and honestly, it was really undeserved, not because the Unforged is amazing by any means, but because other Claymore options just were so mediocre. And despite the 3 new limited Claymores we've gotten since this thing's release, it still remains to be a rather competitive option for Claymore DPS characters that scale off of attack. As with all the weapons in this series, requiring a shield really does drag it down, especially if you don't intend on including a shield character in your party. They're still just decent weapons with a good amount of attack, and that just kind of makes them generic, but never overly impressive. Despite that, this still manages to compete with Wolf's Gravestone, which to this day is one of the best Claymore options. Hopefully, Navia will save us from this. Number 6, the Vortex Vanquisher, also kind of known as Zhongli's signature weapon. This thing obviously suffers from all of the same problems as the Unforged does. The only difference is there are a lot better polearms to choose from. Despite that, it still ends up being a respectable choice in Xiao teams, given that he is almost inseparable from Zhongli's shield. But given that even on Xiao, Primordial Jade Spear, the standard weapon, beats this thing out, it's kind of hard to recommend this, and say it's ever better than the Unforged, and despite the fact that we do have a lot of really valuable polearm supports, the stacking mechanic is really unfriendly when it comes to snapshotting and just makes it an unappealing option across the board, and for that reason, I think it is worse than the Unforged. Number 5, Memory of Dust. Okay, these are all the same weapon series. All the same criticisms can be said about all three of them. The main difference is with the Memory of Dust, we have gotten 3 DPS catalyst users in recent times, being Wander, Risley, and Nuvalet, all of which bringing new catalysts into the mix that quite frankly made this thing a lot less valuable. And once again, just like the Unforged and the Vortex Vanquisher, this thing just underperforms compared to limited 5-star weapons and even some 4-star catalysts such as the Widsith. But honestly, you can switch the positions of either of these three weapons, and I would probably be okay with it. The reason that I put Memory of Dust last here is because it's got to compete with things like the Widsith for DPS or Thrilling Tales for supports. Ultimately, the positioning is more or less like a 3-way tie. It's just, you know, in my opinion, the Catalyst is the worst of these 3. Number 4, Song of Broken Pines, Eula's signature weapon. I know people are going to get upset about this. Look, it's no secret that Physical is suffering right now in Genshin Impact, but that's not the reason why I'm putting this weapon so low. The reason I'm putting it below things like the Unforged and the Vortex Vanquisher is because this thing was released forever ago in the grand scheme of the game now, and it's still only good on 2 characters, Razor and Eula. And of one of those, it's not even best in slot. On Razor, Wolf's Gravestone has always beaten this thing out because he already gets so much attack speed, and when you have really high attack speed, you just get punished more and more by hit lag. Even on Eula, the character this thing was designed for, it is barely better than an R5 Serpent Spine. And here I was about to say, I was literally recording a line saying like, how likely are we to ever get another Physical Claymore character before something else? And I forgot about Freminet. Okay, we got Freminet, but according to KQM, this thing ain't even best in slot on him either. Should the day come that we ever get a 5-star limited Claymore physical DPS again, I'm sure they'll get a limited weapon that is better than this. It's just not a very good weapon, and it's certainly not very future-proofed. Number 3, Jadefall Splendor, Baiju's signature weapon. We all know this thing to be a bad weapon, but what makes it so bad? The answer to that is in the passive. As with all signature weapons, this thing was designed for Baiju. The problem is, it was designed so much for Baiju that literally no other Catalyst user can actually benefit from this thing. Most other characters are only going to get 3 seconds of this bonus, and even if you have a 12-second cooldown burst, which very few characters do, that's really not worth equipping this thing just for that. So really, it's an HP percent stat stick. Another problem it has is that it's also not the lowest base attack possible, meaning it doesn't even have as much HP percent as it could have. The thing that really makes me rate this weapon so poorly though is the fact that even on Baiju, I think there are cases to not use it over 4-star options even if you have this thing. The energy regen that this thing provides can almost be rivaled by an R5 prototype Amber, while also giving your team a little bit of extra healing, which if you ask me is a lot more valuable than Baiju doing a little bit more damage thanks to the elemental damage bonus. Especially when you consider that one of his best uses now is to pair him with Farina and maximize her buff as quickly as possible. While Baiju certainly does not need the help in healing for survivability's sake, it really does help maximizing that buff, which is what he is there to do. You can also help out his energy with something like Fav's Codex, which isn't entirely selfish, or go down the Sack Frags route, which also again is not entirely selfish, but will help his own particle generation quite a bit as well as offer a big chunk of party healing. Even if I had this weapon, I honestly don't know if I would use it over something like Sack Frags or Prototype Amber. Number 2, the Summit Shaper, also kind of known as Albedo's signature weapon. Okay, so a lot of you might be asking, why am I rating this one so much more harshly than I did the other 3 weapons in this series? It's primarily due to the fact that just like bows, swords have such an insane selection. Among those is also the Primordial Jade Cutter, an absurdly generic weapon that almost any character in the game can utilize thanks to its insanely high crit rate substat. Now the one character that can't comfortably use this is Ayaka, which coincidentally happens to be Summit Shaper's pretty much best character. Ayaka is pretty unique from the other sword DPS in that she is not nearly as hurt by the lack of crit rate thanks to her insane amount of base crit stats from her Ascension and her Blizzard Strayer artifact set. This makes her artifacts a lot easier to build than your average sword DPS, and you're often trying to get more attack percent in place of what normally would be crit rate. So the high attack percent that Summit Shaper offers is rather important, but even then, it is still not very good compared to all the other limited 5-star weapons that we have gotten. While unlike unlike the other three, this thing does actually generally perform better than the standard weapons. Not that that's hard, because Aquila Favonia and the Skyward Blade are just really bad or situational. I just think it is so wildly outclassed by the limited options that there's really no reason to ever use this thing unless it is your only option. Combine that with the fact that many sword DPS these days don't use shield characters. Like Alhaitham, you'll rarely find a shield in his typical parties. Ayaka, even most of those have ditched the shield these days in favor of Shenna or Rosaria. Kaching is doing aggravate teams with a Dendro healer, since you're almost never going to reasonably activate this thing to its full effect, and even when it is, it's still not that great. On top of that, every limited 5-star sword we get just puts this thing deeper in the ground. Number 1, the Everlasting Moonglow, also known as Kokomi's signature weapon, the Coconut Donut. This weapon, much like Kokomi's constellations, were designed for DPS. The problem is, she may have also kind of been designed for DPS, but she's just not used as one because she's not a very good DPS. Mandatory statement of yes, play her for DPS if you have fun with her. It doesn't matter as long as you're clearing the content that you want to be clearing. It doesn't matter if it's viable or not, but for the most of us, we don't use Kokomi as a DPS because her ceiling is just so incredibly low. Naturally, that means we don't want a weapon that is geared towards her DPS side when we want to use her as a hydro off-field support, or primarily as a healer. And while this thing does have an HP substat and an outgoing healing bonus, that does make her a better healer. It's just that does nothing to increase your team's damage, which is what most of us want from our supports. After all, good healing alone is not what makes a good healer slash support. Otherwise, Chi-Chi would be a top tier character because she is an amazing healer. That's just literally all she does. We need Kokomi to apply off-field hydro and buff our other teammates in what ways they can. That leaves most people using Thrilling Tales over her signature weapon, or over the thought of ever even getting it, because Thrilling Tales is basically her best in slot support option. And honestly, what can be worse for a 5-star limited weapon than being beaten by a 3-star? Even outside of Thrilling Tales, for if you hate that kind of effect, she still has 3 other good free-to-play options, including a craftable in Prototype Amber. And should you ever try to use this thing as a stat stick, it is virtually identical to the Jade Fall Splendor Baiju's weapon, but the only difference is the passive effect on this is literally dead on everybody. There is like not a single other character that could utilize any part of that passive bonus, unlike the Jade Fall Splendor, which at least you might get like 1 tick of the energy regen. It's neither are great, but they can be used for that on a character like Nouvelette. That's it. That's my take on the list. Tell me what you think in the comments. You know, I'm sure there's some that people are going to wildly disagree with, mostly placement, because I genuinely do believe that the 10 weapons on this are probably the 10 that belong in the worst list. The order is just maybe debatable. So tell me what you think down in the comments below, and if you were saving for Farina's weapon, you didn't get it, it's probably for the better. It's really only up from here. So thank you to you for watching. Thank you to my members and my patrons for supporting me as always, and I'll see you in the next one.
Attaboy!